They did not know. Not from the newsreels in Hamburg, not from the officers' briefings in Sicily, not from the swaggering radio voices that promised America would crack like cheap glass. They did not know that a prison camp ringed with barbed wire could smell like summer cream sugar a ghost-cold breeze rolled out of steel vats. On a blistering afternoon, 18th July 1944, the mess hall doors of Camp Concordia swung wide and a guard with dust on his boots held up a metal paddle. On it, white, soft, impossible curled ice cream. In the corner, wooden crates were stenciled with the swooping script they had only seen in caricature Coca-Cola. Silence fell, the way snow falls, one flake, then a hush, then a wait. A Bremen machinist laughed once, short and hard, as if to spit out a lie he'd swallowed whole. Another man reached for the bowl and drew back, ashamed of the tremor in his hand. They had been taught that Americans were soft, spoiled by comfort, addicted to frivolity. But what reached their tongues was not decadence, it was system. Cold, measured, scheduled. A sweetness that arrived the way shells arrived because timetables said it would. Outside, the prairie droned with cicadas. Inside, spoons chimed against tin. The first sip of cola stung, the gums hissed like a secret, and for a heartbeat, every memory of the front hedgerow's mortars, the iron stink of a bad morning, slid backward. The Geneva rules were on the wall. The Red Cross parcels were stacked neat. And here in the enemy's custody was something no briefing had prepared them for mercy, as logistics morale, as an engineered deliverable. One prisoner scar, traced from jaw to ear, counted without meaning to. 2 scoops per man, company by company, hour by hour. Milk sugar ice power, trucks and rails, bottles and caps. If this was the spare capacity for men in the wrong uniform, what did the right uniform get? The question spread down the line like a ripple in a field of wheat. They did not say it aloud. But the truth, cold, undeniable, melted on their tongues. We never understood what we were fighting. The door banged again. Another tray. Another curl of white. A crate lid pried up with a crowbar glass winking in the dim. They had come expecting punishment calibrated to hate. They found a machine calibrated to run. And that more than the taste was the shock. Before the wire and the sweetness there was certainty. Posters with hawk-nosed heroes and clean angles. Newsreels where cities fell in black and white and brass bands swallowed the sound of hunger. In barracks from the steppe to the Straits of Messina, German soldiers were told a story that fit perfectly. America was a land of jazz and chewing gum of assembly lines that made toys and talk a mongrel giant too clumsy to fight clean, too soft to suffer long. The Wehrmacht had spine, the Yankees had soda. The rest wrote itself. In Sicily, an NCO tacked up a cartoon, a GI lugging a phonograph through a swamp, while a German grenadier strode by with a rifle like a promise. Laughter came easy, because contempt is cheap and rations were short. Briefings stressed materialism as if the word were a defect that could be exploited like a gap in a wall. Goebbels' voice on the radio was a metronome: American decadence, American cowardice, American chaos. Even when Tunisia collapsed and U-boats began to vanish into the Atlantic, without enough tonnage to show for it, the tone did not change. Explanations were technical. Faith remained emotional. Life at the front hardened the bias. German units prized craftsmanship, field repairs done with a file, and patience, the romance of the lone expert coaxing a machine to sing. American kit looked crude from a distance, thick steel, simple lines overbuilt. Rumors insisted their supply columns needed chocolate to march and hot meals to fight. That their discipline was a paycheck. If abundance was visible, it was framed as weakness. Who drags laundries and kitchens to war, except men who cannot do without? Between operations, men crowded around a battered wireless, listening to voices that flattened a continent into a chessboard. They did not hear the timetables humming behind those American kitchens. They did not see the quartermasters counting calories with the same ruthlessness they counted shells. They saw K-rations and thought candy. They saw Coke and thought circus. They did not see the rails and trucks and ice plants threaded through the Republic like veins. By mid-war, scarcity bent everything. Fuel cut maneuvers to sketches. Spare parts became favors. Leave shrank to rumor. Yet the messaging held its shape: hold fast, outlast, outsuffer. America would tire first, too fond of comfort, too easily bored. That thesis tasted like pride and necessity mixed. It was also wrong. But it would take offense a menu board and a metal paddle lifting a curl of white to prove it beyond argument. They laughed because the story was convenient. In barracks and briefing huts, the Axis line on America was a neat, repeatable theorem. A nation of consumers cannot be a nation of warriors. Propaganda gave it color and rhythm, radio baritones intoning that Yankees were addicted to comfort. Cartoons of GIs juggling chewing gum cameras and phonographs. Editorials sneering that a people who measured life in paychecks and products would panic when the bill came due. It sounded plausible because it flattered sacrifice. If we endure mud and hunger, surely they cannot. The talking points were drilled to cadence. Americans were soft, too many calories, too many choices. Americans were decadent jazz films, idioms that slipped like oil off steel. Americans were chaotic, a federation of interests that could never move in step. Even their machines were suspect stamped steel and thick tolerances, not the knife-edge fit of a craftsman's pride. A soldier who believes the enemy is unserious finds fear easier to carry. There were numbers, but they were framed as threats that would collapse under their own weight. Yes, the United States had factories. The line insisted those factories made frippery and could not pivot to hardship. Yes, the United States had food. Excess would rot morale. Yes, the United States had money. Money bought cowards and mercenaries, not discipline. The bias hid in the conclusions. Quantity without soul, the lectures said, is noise. From the line, companies' upward anecdotes hardened the thesis. A captured leaflet bragging of PX comforts became proof that Americans needed soda to fight. Stories of mobile laundries and field kitchens were recast as indulgences, not endurance multipliers. Even the Geneva Convention, presented at home as civilized duty, was painted to the rank and file as evidence the Yankees expected mercy because they could not stomach pain. A culture accustomed to bottled pleasures, the logic ran, would run dry when the bottles did. Underneath the rhetoric pulsed envy and scarcity. Men who scraped gaskets by lamplight and traded favors for a liter of fuel could not imagine an army where spares were a line on a schedule, not a prayer. Pride translated that gap into contempt. What we suffer makes us pure. What they enjoy makes them weak. The story metabolized bad news. If American offensives succeeded, it was because they were wasteful, not because they were organized. If American units refused to break it, was because they were doped with candy and promises, not because their system fed both stomach and will. So they laughed at the Coke ads painted on the sides of trucks, at the rumors of ice machines on ships, at the idea that a quartermaster might plan comfort the way an artilleryman plots fire. They laughed, and the laughter felt like armor. Only later, standing in a quiet American camp with a cold bottle in hand and a bowl of something impossible melting in July heat, would many of them discover what the joke had been, protecting a fear not of softness, but of a civilization that had engineered even kindness and could deliver it on time. The map said the ridge had no name, only a contour that folded like a sleeping animal above a road chalked with dust. Morning broke thin and hard. The air smelled of wild thyme and cordite. By 9, the problem was not poetry, but physics. The American advance pressed along lanes hemmed by stone walls and olive groves, radios crackling, scouts flickering from shadow to shadow. German and Italian units, frayed by days of withdrawal, tried to knit a line on the fly. Then the artillery found its range. Shells tore the ridge into arithmetic over short on. The sky stuttered, the ground kicked. A machine gun team that had sworn to hold until dark suddenly had no barrel to cool and no gun to feed. Orders brave clear arrived with a delay that turned clarity to risk. A runner tripped in a terrace and did not get up. Heat swelled, canteens ran low. The line bent. For the Americans, the problem was tempo and mouths. Men eat even while advancing. Trucks burn fuel even while waiting. The ridgelines and mule tracks of Sicily punished wheels and schedules. The red ball miracles that would later roar across France did not exist yet. Here, combat echelons leaned on improvised dumps, captured wells, borrowed mules. Ammunition arrived in fits, rations in bursts. Medics triaged under stone eaves, tourniquets dark with dust. The Army's future logistic genius was embryonic, brave, competent, but not yet the fluent machine it would become. On some days, the front outran the food. In that churn capture was rarely a tableau. It was a drift. A mortar section pinned and half-deaf fell back a terrace too far and found itself staring at a squad whose uniforms looked wrong in the glare. A lieutenant waved his men into a fold of ground, called for smoke that had already been spent, and made a choice between a small surrender now or a useless death in the next minute. A burst from a Browning cut the argument short. The survivors raised hands, because living is a discipline too. The surrender did not feel like the end of a story. It felt like a change in temperature. The Americans who searched them were dusty, sunburned, efficient. One spoke schoolroom German clumsy but respectful. Another thrust a canteen toward a prisoner who had been pretending his mouth was not a kiln. On the road below, trucks fidgeted in a queue that promised movement and delay in equal measure. The prisoners waited in a ditch that smelled of fennel, reading each other's faces for the shape of what came next. What came next was not what their lectures had prepared them for. A field kitchen pushed forward behind the column like a logistical conscience pans sloshing. A medic checked a cut scalp with hands that had learned the same anatomy on other heads. When the convoy finally rolled, crates clinked somewhere under a tarp, the sound as domestic as a pantry and as terrifying as a truth. The prisoners rode with guards who were bored, rather than enraged, who argued about baseball, who offered a cigarette without the theater of magnanimity. The road unwound through villages that watched with the impersonal curiosity of people who have already decided who will win. Behind them, Sicily continued to solve the Allies' problem. In the messy way, problems are solved by friction, improvisation, and an appetite for learning. Dumps grew more disciplined. Routes were deconflicted. The habit of moving comfort alongside ammo began to look less like indulgence and more like doctrine. But the prisoners did not see the doctrine yet. They saw a ridge receding, a war shrinking to the dimensions of a truck bed, and a horizon that impossibly might include the taste of something cold. They did not believe it. Not yet. But the clink of bottles under canvas had already begun to edit the story they had been given. The idea did not begin as kindness. It began as arithmetic. In 1942, while the front lines were still a map full of future tents, the U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps sat with tables that looked more like engineering blueprints than menus. Calories per man per day, protein minimums, vitamin targets, thermal loads for refrigerated cars running through Missouri summers. The problem set expanded how to make hot food appear. At the end of a 20-mile march, how to keep bread from going stale in jungle humidity. How to serve coffee that tasted like home on a ship pitching under North Atlantic sleet. What seemed like comfort, what enemies would later call decadence, was drafted as policy because morale, if measured and supplied, becomes a weapon. The impossible idea was simple to state and hard to execute. Build a logistics culture that treats the soldier's body and spirit as inseparable requirements, and then extend that discipline to the enemy once he is in your custody. That meant writing Geneva not as a concession, but as a schedule. It meant designing camps where water-light sanitation and medical care were not afterthoughts, but first-order constraints. It meant most audaciously adding small sweetnesses to the same pipeline that moved TNT and diesel milk sugar syrups, glass bottles, carbon dioxide ice. Factories in the interior, unbombed, overclocked, obedient to timetables, became the laboratories. Dairy plants learned to pivot from civilian quartz to military tubs, stainless steel licked clean by steam and rules. Railroads lent cold cars that rumbled from creameries to depots like slow artillery. Engineers wrote chilling loads as if they were gunnery tables. Ambient temperature, insulation value, transit time expected melt. Over the same wires that pulsed with orders for shells and spare parts, quartermasters requested churns, compressors, and the spare gaskets that keep cold where it belongs. Camps themselves became test beds. A mess sergeant in Texas discovered that if you staged the evening meal 15 minutes later and ran the generator at a steady load through the hottest hour, the icebox stabilized and waste dropped by a third. A dietitian in Nebraska substituted powdered milk on weeks when rail hiccups threatened the schedule and found that prisoners complained less when a slice of pie sat beside the compromise. A chaplain's assistant scrounged sheet music and learned that an orchestra rehearsal could keep 100 men out of trouble better than an extra guard tower. These were small experiments, but the United States has a talent for multiplying small. The humane layer. What the prisoners felt first wove itself through the gears. Medical tents smelled of phenol and soap. Vaccination rosters were kept with the same square-jawed neatness as payroll. Work details were matched to bodies rather than resentments. The old pressed apples instead of lifting timber. The wounded shelled peas and wrote letters for those who could not. In the canteen, a glass bottle became a token of normal time cap hissing label sweating, handed across a counter by a bored private, who said "here," as if the war were a rumor. None of this erased cruelty from the world. A camp is still a camp. A fence is still a confession. There were shortages and sour officers and days when the trucks didn't come. But the doctrine held when the trucks did come, they came with more than calories. They came with the message that order is a form of mercy. The guards felt it too. A corporal who could produce ice in July believed in his bones that his side would win. A cook who could plate dignity in a bowl believed he served something larger than soup. Industry sensing both contract and crusade tuned itself to the rhythm. A bottling plant in Kansas added a night shift. A glassworks in Ohio adopted a more forgiving mold to cut breakage by fractions that became carloads. A sugar refinery stacked bags in pyramids that looked like sculpture. Civilian bottlers took on military routes. The company's promise wherever the soldier is was not poetry, but logistics. When a convoy rolled past a camp and a few cases fell off the paperwork into a canteen, no one called it theft. They called it alignment. The impossible part, the part that made Axis prisoners go quiet with a spoon halfway to the mouth, wasn't the taste. It was the bureaucracy made benevolent. Rules laminated and posted. Inspection stamps aligned in tidy columns. A schedule of canteen hours that was actually kept. The genius was not a man with a eureka, but a million minor decisions, obeyed thermostats, checked, relids, tightened spare parts, ordered before failure routes deconflicted, before a jam could kill a truck and a day and a mood. In that order, men who had been taught to expect humiliation found something harder to carry, a disciplined decency. It didn't ask them to love their captors. It didn't even ask them to change their minds. It simply insisted day after day that a nation able to make cold in July for its enemies had chosen to. That choice tasted like vanilla the first time, like defeat the second, and like a strange, reluctant respect forever after. The laboratory doors were never dramatic. They swung on greased hinges in mess halls, depots, and offices where pencils dulled to nubs over columns of figures. But the output was theater steam rising from trays at sunset, a bottle cap pinging on concrete, a rumor that another camp had started its own churn and needed a crate of gaskets. The Quartermaster Corps did not write poetry, and yet it wrote the lines that prisoners would remember when the shouting parts of war had faded light at a switch clean sheets on a cot, a bowl that did not empty before the man did. In a world that had given them so many arguments to hate, the system offered a different argument, measured, methodical, and to men from Bremen and Bavaria and beyond, impossible until it was not. The secret was not a secret at all. It was scale disciplined by schedules, wealth disciplined by war aims, and a distribution architecture that treated distance like a solvable equation. Begin with capacity, a continental economy unscarred by bombing with power grids that could bear the load and rail networks that could shuffle priorities by the hour. Add manufacturing that had learned the gospel of interchangeable parts decades earlier, presses and molds and dies that could be repurposed by changing binders in Foreman clipboards, not rewriting physics. Then fit morale into that template as just another commodity, units per man per day, measured and met. Consider the path of a single cold treat from cow to camp. Milk is pooled at creameries feeding into refrigerated rail cars, mechanical refrigeration, not ice, eliminating the tyranny of melt over long runs. Sugar rides in from refineries on different tracks, its flows deconflicted at a division level that maps not only bullets but sweetness. Syrups are cooked in kettles whose temperature profiles are logged like powder lots. Churns spin in plants that file weekly maintenance reports. Gaskets and seals are reorder pointed like spark plugs. Output loads into insulated containers, then into trucks staged in a ladder of depots, national, regional, local. At each rung, a clerk with a pencil and a clock closes the loop received, stored, issued. If a train is late, a phone call jumps a truck a level. If a compressor throws a belt, the depot mechanic's bin already has a replacement, because a captain 3 states away signed a requisition last month expecting this failure today. Run the same mental film for a bottle. Glass is batched, formed, annealed, inspected. Wastage is charted and shaved. Carbon dioxide is captured and compressed. Cylinders are swapped like artillery tubes. Labels arrive as pallets, glue as drums. A bottler near a railhead installs a second line. Filling heads are cleaned to a protocol. Caps are crimped, tested, crated. Cases stacked to forklift logic pallets, to truck logic trucks, to convoy logic. The plant's daily output is not poetry, but integer math. X cases per hour times Y hours equals Z truckloads. Z slots are reserved at the depot. The depot's slots cross-feed units that have sent via signal projected demand curves based on weather training cycles and morale events. A camp celebration next Thursday. The schedule already knows because someone bothered to write it down and someone else bothered to read it. Wealth underwrites the whole scaffolding. It is not only dollars. It is surplus power, surplus steel, surplus trained hands. It is a labor pool that can move from tractors to tank plants to bottling lines without a revolution of doctrine. It is credit that buys time while machines are delivered and promises that factories will be paid for running at hours that would break smaller economies. When enemies saw a bottle and wrote decadence, they missed the ledger behind it, the millions of quiet transactions that tie farmer to glass, blower to truck driver to quartermaster, to guard to prisoner. Distribution is where the machine becomes visible. Rails allocate priority to perishables in a dance. With ammunition, perishables won't kill if they're late, but lateness turns them into waste, and waste is treason to a war economy. So perishables get. A corridor car consists coupled to minimize switching. Waybills pre-cleared to shave minutes at yards. Refrigerator cars plugged to shore power the minute they stop. Trucks queue to windows. Drivers are briefed with route options, not just directions. If a bridge washes out a liaison at the county level, knows a farmer with a short-term solution and a field kitchen that can pivot recipes to what arrives. The system's genius is not omniscience, it's response time. All of this would be impressive enough if it served only our boys. The shock to the prisoners is that it serves them too. The same discipline that moves penicillin to an aid station moves ice to a mess line because the policy says it should. Not every day, nothing human is every day, but often enough to feel like law. Inspections by neutral parties read like audits. Deficiencies are corrected. The next report shows the line edged upward. A camp commander who can demonstrate smooth canteen operations earns the trust to request more trucks on harvest week, which feeds the civilian economy, which keeps a plant open, which keeps the bottles coming. Feedback loops close not because of sentiment, but because they are designed to. Numbers give texture to the claim without shouting. A depot that turns 700 cases a day does not feel heroic until you map the 700 to men, 1,000 prisoners, 1,000 guards and staff, a nearby training unit passing through. A freezer bank that holds a steady few thousand pounds of product measured in BTUs and amperage and repair tickets speaks a language soldiers understand: uptime, on-time, meantime, between failure. The metrics that govern artillery also govern desert. What about waste? The machine hates it. Melt loss is logged. Routes are rearranged. Deliveries are pulled forward on hotter weeks. Lids are improved. Crews are drilled on door discipline. Breakage rates are posted until they fall. When they rise, someone's name goes on a line, and that someone answers a phone. When a plant falls behind, another takes the slack. Because redundancy was built in on purpose, spares are not only parts, they are people and places. From the outside, the secret sauce looks like excess. From the inside, it looks like control. If you can keep cold from turning warm on a July afternoon 2 states from the bottler, you can keep fuel flowing to a core in winter. If you can make humane treatment predictable for men behind wire, you can make victory predictable for men behind guns. The taste on the tongue is a byproduct. The message in the throat is doctrine. This is what a rich, organized democracy does when it decides to fight, not only overwhelm the enemy at the point of contact, but out-administer him everywhere else. They left the ridge with the sun knifing down the terraces and the taste of cordite still in their throats. Hands-high web belts cut the line of prisoners stepped into a road that had become a production line for movement MPs at intervals, rifles slung instead of bristling a jeep idling like a stopwatch. The first checkpoint took names that would be misspelled and numbers that would decide routes. The second swapped canteens for tags. The third pushed them toward trucks that smelled of oil and rope and America. The convoy crept past stone walls spattered white with lime and goats that stared as if wars were a farmer's rumor. From the bed of a deuce and a half, they saw the Allied column as a kind of organism engineers with picks shouldered like rifles. A field kitchen rattling pans, a water truck, an ambulance whose painted cross had the calm of a chapel door. A corporal in the back American showed a photograph of a baby and then tucked it away with the same motion he used to check his watch. Time, they understood, was not only a measure of distance, but a discipline. The trucks made the port by late evening because some invisible someone had made them do it. Oran came up out of heat like a mirage, solidified cranes, shouldering sky hulls stacked against the horizon, a vowel soup of voices in queues that moved. The prisoners waited in a penned rectangle and watched forklifts weave like choreography. They saw cargo nets swing from holds with a kind of indifferent grace beans and trucks, crates faces in portholes, a dog sleeping on a coil of rope. The harbor was not pretty and did not try to be. It was competent. A guard with a notebook checked them onto a manifest and to their surprise miscounted nothing. The ship that took them west had a belly like a cathedral. Inside, the air changed salt iron, a hint of disinfectant. Bunks folded out like arguments conceded. A lanky sailor with freckles pointed to a painted route to the heads and mimed what to do. It was not kindness exactly, it was momentum. The engines woke and with them a vibration that thudded into bones and made sleep eventually inevitable. When the ship rolled, someone in the hold above spilled a crate. Glass clinked, a guard laughed the smell of caramel, and something chemical drifted down and made men stare at the ribs of the hull as if it could turn transparent and show them the cargo. They did not say the word they were thinking. It would have sounded foolish in that iron dark. Days became squares on a menu board, coffee in a metal cup, stew thick as silence, a wedge of bread, a pamphlet about rights that seemed like a trap until the second reading. The convoy angled north past weather with teeth, then west punching a line across maps they had memorized for other purposes. Drill sounded above like rain with intentions. Somewhere men practiced lifeboats. Somewhere else a cook taught a younger cook to time eggs by the pitch of the deck. The prisoner's world narrowed to a plank, widened to an ocean, narrowed again to a bunk. Nights, the lights dimmed in a way that felt like an order obeyed. No one asked their opinion on anything, and the absence of spite felt like a new element in the periodic table. Hampton Roads announced itself with gray water thronged by piers and a forest of masts. The ship shouldered into a berth, while tugs bullied politely. The gangway clattered down. The air tasted like iron shavings and pine. On shore, a sergeant briefed a line of drivers reading clipboards as if clipboards were scripture. A Red Cross volunteer with lipstick too bright for the morning handed a guard a tray of cups. The guard set them down near the prisoners without ceremony, and the steam that lifted made several men swallow in sync. America began as a smell, then a habit. The train out of the tidewater country slid like an admission. Boxcars for freight coaches for guards and prisoners. A kitchen car breathing steam as if it were alive. Through Virginia, the green stacked like stage scenery. Through the Appalachians, the world turned close and mineral. Through the Ohio bottoms, the land widened and organized itself into assertion corn in ranks. Barns that had learned to stand their ground. Water towers that spelled names like a roll call. Every few hours, the train stepped aside for something with higher priority troop trains, tank flats, refrigerator cars whose doors were shut like secrets, and then re-entered the cadence. Schedules had a pecking order, but pecking still meant order. At a siding in Illinois, a switchman in a cap that had known every kind of weather unclipped a hose and plugged a refrigerator car into shore power. It was a small act, and it radiated significance, cold, guarded like ammunition. A guard noticed the prisoners watching and said in thick schoolroom German, Essen, kalt, food cold. He grinned, shrugged, walked away. The word hung like a rumor with its facts attached. The line west ran past cities the prisoners had only known as radio callouts: St. Louis, with its bridges like iron handwriting; Kansas City, with stockyards marching to the horizon, and a smell of meat that made their mouths remember hunger. Then wheat that went on and on, until the sky seemed to rest in it, like a bird staying the afternoon. At junctions, they saw depot yards arranged like puzzles solved daily, and a new switchback moves, cars reefed into colors of purpose, clerks who wrote numbers on carbon sets and did not smudge. A POW with a machinist's eye began to count the clean welds he saw and gave up. There were too many to be accidents. The camp itself appeared out of the flat, with the suddenness of a decision guard tower's square and unromantic wire that glittered uncompromisingly low barracks aligned to geometry and drainage. A sign said, Camp Concordia, as if the name had been chosen by a committee with no time for poetry. The trucks rolled to a gate, idled, then took their turns because taking turns is how a machine makes fairness look like fate. They climbed down and stretched without meaning to backs cracking like knuckles. The guards checked names again, and the paperwork caught them without missing fingers. On the way in the line past a canteen window, with a counter spattered with ring marks. A crate on the floor showed a looped script that lived until that second in caricature and jokes. The bottles winked in the light. The prisoners kept walking, because walking was the only thing allowed just then. But each man in the private theater behind his eyes watched the future as if it were a reel, just slightly out of focus, spoons on tin, a cold, cherry-lipped burn on the tongue, the steady, unshowy mercy of a system that had decided to include even them. Night brought a prairie wind, a paperwork moon, and a cot that was not comfortable but issued. The generators hummed with the patience of creatures that will outlast quarrels. Somewhere a mess sergeant folded a schedule into his pocket and set a dial a notch colder. In the barracks, a man who had once filed shafts to a speculative fit felt the day's cadence sink into his joints and realized he had been moving inside someone else's competence for a week. The journey had not asked him anything. It had simply carried him relentlessly, predictably toward an answer. The moment they would remember for the rest of their lives did not arrive with a band or a sermon. It arrived as a procedure. Late afternoon sun, white as paper. The mess line doubled past a wall hung with rules in English and German mealtimes, work details, canteen hours, a Geneva excerpt bordered by staples hammered flush. A corporal with a pencil behind his ear ticked columns as men took trays. A fan chopped the heat into manageable pieces. At the far end of the room, where steam lifted out of steel trays like a benediction, something turned with a patient metal noise. A paddle rose. White curled and fell with a soft slap. Ice cream again. Of course, ice cream again. And beside the serving window, anchored by two wooden wedges, sat an open crate of Coca-Cola. The glass beaded the caps, winking like coins. It was not the first time. But repetition is how a shock becomes an argument. The Bremen machinist who had once laughed took his bowl and stepped aside to make room for the man behind him. The scar-chinned sergeant counted by reflex 2 scoops per man, 100 men per company. 2 companies this sitting, 2 sittings before lights. He did not know the dairy schedule. He did not need to. The proof was in the spoon. At a corner table, a guard popped a cap with the heel of his hand and handed the bottle across without theater. The hiss, a clean, surgical little sound, cut through the room. Heads turned, then deliberately turned away, because dignity is a posture, and men will hold it even when their throats are teaching them new words. The prisoner who took the bottle put it to his lips and flinched at the bite. He had been told Americans were addicted to sugar. What reached his tongue was not sweetness alone. It was a chemistry of pressure and process and glass and distance. It was logistics as a sensation. The orchestra, yes. There was an orchestra rehearsed in the barracks nearest the fence. A Strauss waltz pulled into tune by a man who had played in better rooms and for worse men. Notes leaked into the evening like a story retold without malice. Past the wire, a truck reversed to a dock with the patience of a creature that knows its purpose. A clerk signed for something and tore the carbon like a magician, then squared both sheets because squared edges mean fewer arguments later. A Red Cross inspector with tidy shoes stepped out of an office and folded a form. Somewhere a stamp thumped. The camp breathed in cycles, meal mail, work wash, rest, and the cycles did not fail often enough to become jokes. The realization did not strike all at once, or in the same place in the chest. For some it came like embarrassment, a heat at the back of the neck, as if caught boasting in a room where the truth has been in attendance all along. For others it came like grief, for a story believed for a father's certainty, for the elegance of a world in which endurance outruns arithmetic. For a few, it came like relief to be held by competence, even the enemy's, is to put down a weight you did not know was yours. A letter day coincided with dessert. Paper crinkled. A man read that his brother's city had been bombed, and that his mother still stood in lines for cabbage. He ate slowly, not because he wanted to, but because the body throttles itself when it is learning 2 facts at once. Another man read that his village had 2 new graves, and the baker had no yeast. He set the letter under his bowl and stared at the table until the wood grain resolved into a map of nowhere. The ice cream softened. The Coke warmed. The camp's mercy did not argue with the letter's cruelty. Both were true. Both would remain true. The tension between them was the shape of late 1944, after lights talk ran soft along bunks. The guard's radio somewhere down the corridor muttered baseball scores and casualty estimates. Someone asked finally, in a voice that made no demands and offered no surrender, "How do they do this?" No one answered. Not because they could not, but because saying it would make it a verdict. The machinist understood gaskets and belts and the upstream math of glass and sugar. The farmer understood cows and railheads and the sturdiness of schedules. The teacher understood doctrine made visible. None of them wanted to translate the knowledge into defeat. So they didn't. They lay on cots that nodded under the weight of civilians they had been once and soldiers they would be again, and they listened to a generator hum in the confident key of a country self-appointed to run on time. In the days that followed, the realization found forms. A work detail at a cannery saw waste tracked on a chalkboard and watched breakage fall because a foreman decided to be ashamed of the number. A chapel service ended and a corporal lingered to set out hymnals in square piles as if symmetry were a promise. A sick call line moved at the speed of pencil and tray jab and cotton ball stamp and next, and men who had learned to mistrust order felt it hold without cutting. A truck missed a delivery and someone apologized. The apology landed like a revolution. At inspection, the Geneva excerpt on the wall acquired force not from the text, lawyers make text, but from the way the day obeyed it, pay for labor, letters forwarded, parcels logged. There were exceptions, always. Human beings leak. A petty tyrant shouted. A shipment spoiled. A man with a loud voice decided to be cruel because his day had gone wrong. But exceptions broke against the bulkhead of routine, and routine is what builds memory. Ask them years later and they would not remember the name of the corporal or the brand of compressor. They would remember the taste of cold at the wrong time of year and the way a schedule feels when it loves no one in particular and therefore treats everyone the same. Christmas neared. Rumors said the kitchen would try pudding. The orchestra practiced a carol that belonged to no flag. The guard with the schoolroom German wished men a good evening and meant it without making it a speech. Snow came like a thought the sky had been refining all day. A prisoner stepped outside and let flakes find his face. He thought of the ridge in Sicily and of men who had not made this voyage. He thought of posters and radio voices and a thesis that had kept him warm until this precise minute. He could feel it cooling. Back inside, the bottle cap he had palmed on the train rattled in his pocket. He set it spinning on the table and watched it wobble and fall until friction decided for it. The cap lay still, a small circle of stamped metal that had crossed a war to land here. He touched it once lightly, as if it could answer the question that was no longer a question, but a fact. They had said Americans were soft. The bowl in his hand, empty now, said otherwise. He looked at the men around him, tired, thin, argumentative, alive, and understood the humiliation beneath the comfort. To be treated well by an enemy is to be measured by a standard that does not include your pride. He did not love it. He accepted it the way a man accepts weather. Later he would write home using careful words, He would say the rules were observed, the food sufficient, the guards indifferent in a way that was oddly generous. He would not write about the flavor. He would not need to. The person reading would not believe that part anyway. The truth would live where it had always lived, between the lines in the cadence of sentences written by a man who has learned that his map of the world was 2 dimensions shy. And when the lights went out, and the generator settled to its night note, the camp kept time with a country that had decided that even mercy could be manufactured. The realization completed itself without fanfare. They had not been beaten only by guns or tanks. They had been beaten by a schedule, by a ledger, by a nation that made the extraordinary ordinary so ordinary that a prisoner could hold it in a spoon, watch it melt and taste in the last cold sweetness on his tongue, the unarguable shape of defeat. News does not travel as headlines in a prison camp. It travels as comparisons. A clean cot after a long march, a bottle that hisses open on schedule, a bowl that fills the same way on Tuesday and Thursday. The cumulative effect was not euphoria, but erosion, an abrasive daily sanding of the axis thesis that endurance could outlast abundance. Men who had been catechized to despise comfort learned against their will that reliability has a moral weight. If the enemy can make mercy predictable, what else can he make inevitable? Letters home censored but legible between the lines smuggled this ambiguity back across oceans. Orderly one wrote, regular wrote another. A wife reading in Hamburg or Bremen would not taste the vanilla, but she would feel the cadence the captors keep their rules. Rumor is a strategist. Soon at reserve depots and convalescent wards, stories of American camps circulated with the same stubbornness as stories of American tanks, different instruments of the same orchestra. The propaganda line, soft, decadent, unserious, had to contort to absorb the image of an enemy who could refrigerate kindness at scale. For the fighting men still at the front, the shock reported by returned or exchanged prisoners did not instantly crack resolve. It reweighted fear. We are not facing an improvisation. A Feldwebel told his platoon. Near the end, we are facing a schedule. This is not the stuff of posters, but it is the stuff of decisions, when to break contact, when to believe the next resupply will not arrive, when to interpret every American pause as a coiling rather than a stall. Unit diaries in late 1944 and early 1945 sound at times less fatalistic than lucid. The machine will keep coming. Our courage does not multiply. The moral bleed continued after surrender. Camps that ran like timetables taught men how to inhabit routine again, work. Detail, pay chit chapel orchestra habits that some would carry into reconstructed lives. A small number would emigrate after the war, drawn not by sweetness, but by predictability. For many more, the memory of cold dessert in July became an index card in the mind labeled, "What we got wrong." That card does not win battles by itself, but thousands of such cards tucked into thousands of men help write an ending battlefield defeat reinforced by administrative demonstration. The Allied war machine rolled not only over ground, it rolled through expectations. And once morale concedes that the future belongs to schedules, the present becomes a long negotiating retreat. I expected hatred measured in rations. I found rations measured in rules. The rules frightened me more than hatred. In July, I tasted ice cream. It was not luxury. It was certainty. I realized we had misnamed their strength. We said Americans were soft. Their softness had steel inside. It arrived on time. I learned the Geneva Articles from a wall, and then from the day obeying the wall. The bottle cap in my pocket is my defeat round ordinary, the noise of a machine that never raised its voice. Logistics felt like weather, indifferent everywhere, impossible to argue with. I thought I would resent them more for treating us well. Instead, I resented the lies that made me surprised. Mercy as procedure was the most foreign thing, not sentiment procedure. I believed craft would beat quantity. In captivity, I learned the word was reliability. It beats both. A guard apologized when a delivery was late. In that moment, I knew our war was already over. Courage can win a hill. A schedule wins a continent. When I wrote home, I did not write ice cream. I wrote regular. My wife understood. The enemy gave me a clean spoon and a job. I remembered what a country is for. I do not praise them. I acknowledge them. It is different, but it is difficult. Once you have seen kindness arrive by truck, You never again say the word decadent without tasting metal. After the war, I worked in a factory. When the line ran true, I heard a generator in Kansas. The lesson was not sweetness. The lesson was capacity of machines and of law. They beat us with arithmetic. That is not romantic, which is why it is true. If a nation can keep cold in July for prisoners, it can keep anything it wants, including victory. I walked into the camp as a believer in slogans. I walked out as a student of schedules.